So negative feedback is quite complex because there's a lot going on. But the key thing is it turns off a corrective measure, which sounds really odd. But if you think about it as if your body's overheating, you start to sweat. Once you reach a certain temperature, return back to normal, 37 degrees, you need to stop sweating. Otherwise, your temperature will continue to drop. So the stopping of sweating is the negative feedback. It's moving away from a norm, going back to the norm, and when you hit that norm, negative feedback occurs and switches off the corrective measure. There are two main hormones that control this. There's thyroxine and adrenaline. Adrenaline doesn't actually have a negative feedback response, but is part of the control mechanism. Thyroxine, though, is a major one for metabolic rate. So we're going to look at that in more detail. But first off, we need to really understand this negative feedback loop. So what's happening is the person here is exercising and their body temperature is increasing. That is detected by a sensory receptor, in this case the hypothalamus, which determines the body temperature is rising. This could be dangerous, so we need to bring it down. The way you bring it down is by sweating, for example. You can also do other things as well, but let's say sweating is the main one. This leads to evaporation of fluid on the body and helps to cool the body down. If we keep on cooling the body down, we will actually reach a danger point where we go below our baseline body temperature. So once the correct temperature is arrived at, we stop sweating. We actually switch off the corrective measure, in this case sweating, so therefore the person will not actually go into a state where their body temperature drops too low. That is negative feedback. So it all relies on a set point, which is the normal, so 37 degrees, a particular amount of blood sugar level, or particular pH. A receptor will detect if there's any deviation or movement from that. So your body temperature goes up or down. Receptors detect this and will then notify the controller, which is a coordination center, such as the brain, which will now process what's actually happened. And that controller will in turn send an impulse to the effector, which will correct the deviation. So it'll go, you're getting too hot, start sweating, you're getting too cold, start shivering, etc. We still have not yet done negative feedback. Negative feedback occurs when the corrective measure is fixed and we need to stop doing whatever we're doing. So in that case, that's where the negative feedback loop sort of steps in and it reports back to the receptor to say, are we at the correct temperature? Receptor sends an impulse to the controller saying no, effector keeps doing what it's doing. As soon as it says, yes, we're back, metaphorically, the controller will then process that and switch off the effector doing whatever it's doing. In this case, you'll stop sweating. That is negative feedback. A good way of thinking about this is the boiler in a house. You walk into a house and it's very cold, say 14 degrees, so you turn the thermostat up to 20 degrees. The boiler switches on. That's the effector starting up. The temperature in the house slowly starts to rise, so it gets to 70 degrees. The thermostat checks the room temperature and tells the boiler to stay on. The boiler keeps on warming the house. As soon as the house gets to 20 degrees, the thermostat detects this, sends a message to the boiler, and the boiler switches off. That is negative feedback. It can also be simplified down to quite an easy diagram. If the factor stays normal, so 37 degrees, there's no need to do anything because you're the right temperature. If pH is 7 and it stays at 7, don't have to do anything. But if the factor increases, receptors send impulse to the detection center, often the brain, and that then sends impulses to the effector, which starts to bring about the corrective response. And ultimately, we will return to normal. Exactly the same happens if the factor decreases. Receptors send impulse to the detector, detector to the effector, effector starts the corrective response, say shivering, and eventually will return back to the normal. And that is the negative feedback loop, that whole system there. But really, negative feedback is when it switches off that corrective measure, as I keep on saying. So the big problem is if we don't have a negative feedback and we return back to normal, we will keep going. And that can be just as dangerous as the raise in temperature or the raise in pH. So we need to make sure we don't do that. That's why negative feedback is so important. And I've said it enough times that hopefully you're getting this in your head. It switches off or turns off the corrective measure. So the internal environment decreases or increases and changes brought about to return it back to where it should be. We see this in glucose and insulin control because as we deviate from normal blood sugar level, either going high or low, the pancreas will detect this, send hormones to the correct target organs or cells, and they will return it back to where it should be. So thyroxine is very, very important. It controls a lot of metabolic processes. It also is linked very carefully to the pituitary gland. There's lots of communication chemically between the thyroid, where thyroxine is produced, and the pituitary gland, which is often referred to as the master gland in the brain. Thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland in the throat, roughly in the middle of the neck, and it does produce the hormones vital for maintaining metabolism. So there's lots of things that are occurring here, and it uses iodine to help support this. If you have a deficiency in iodine, the thyroid gland can swell, and you actually end up with a thing called a goiter in the neck. It's a big swelling at the base of the neck. But like I said, it controls metabolism, so the rate at which chemical reactions take place and we gain energy from the food. It also helps with developmental and growth in both adults and children. Is key to communicating with the pituitary gland. So what happens is the pituitary gland will stimulate the thyroid to maintain metabolic function. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released in the pituitary gland. This goes to the thyroid and stimulates the thyroid to either make more thyroxine or reduce the manufacturing of thyroxine to help maintain balance. So if thyroxine levels fall, more thyroxine stimulating hormone is produced. Once it returns to normal, we stop producing TSH and negative feedback has been achieved. The other hormone that's part of this system but is not a negative feedback hormone is adrenaline. Adrenaline is our fight or flight response. It allows us to deal with shock and anger situations, to either attack whatever it is or run away from it. And it has lots of effects. None of these are actually negative feedback. They are just stimulating effects, but it's part of the control mechanism. So it falls into that category. So heart rate and breathing rate will increase, which means we get more glucose and oxygen to the brain and the muscles where it's going to be used. It also liberates a lot of glycogen into glucose, which is dumped directly into the bloodstream, which is going to be used for respiration because muscles and stuff like that will run on enhanced energy demand because we're going to have to run away or fight something. Also, pupils dilate, which allows more light in, so we can respond to situations, we can see things clearer. It actually increases mental awareness, so we can deal with threats, we can process it quicker. Processing speed actually goes up when adrenaline is produced. It inhibits blood flow to the digestive system. This is why our stomach grumbles when we're nervous. We get butterflies in the stomach, same thing. You might also need to go to the toilet because that also shuts down as well. The nervous sort of things before exams where I've just been, but I need to go again. And once this is all passed, so the fight or flight response is over, everything returns back to normal. And a couple of interesting facts to finish off on. We talked about temperature quite a bit during this. So we've got two things that can influence our temperature. We've got hyperthermia, which is high body temperature, and can lead to a breakdown in the entire metabolic process. You can have seizures, fits, you can fall into a coma. And if you move into an extreme hypothermic state, it can lead to death. Very, very dangerous. It just means that we can't get rid of heat fast enough. And the opposite of that is hypothermia, which is low body temperature, below 35. And enzymes just can't function at that. They don't denature, they just metabolic function slows, and then respiration cannot be achieved, and you can actually fall into a coma and die at both ends of the spectrum here. There's also some characteristic things with hypothermia, such as you end up with a bluing of the lips and a grey or ashen appearance to the face. Anyway, that's all. Thank you. Bye.